guys, you're listening to Out There with Shay, Alexia and Summer.
We are a youth radio podcast show here to discuss issues, topics and events relevant to youth in Macedon Ranges area.
This week we're going to be letting you guys know more about mental health. Today our guest speaker is Tim, who is joining us again. Tim, can you please remind us of what you do?
So I'm a social worker and I'm also the manager of community services, Community Welbeing services here. I've been working with young people for a very, very long time in lots of different spaces, including mental health.
What would you say are some common misconceptions about mental health and mental illness?
Well, it's interesting because I think 30, 40 years ago people thought that they could catch it. Now, they don't think that now.
Really?
People also think that it won't happen to them, and sometimes it can. Sometimes context can conspire against us and things can mean that we fall into mental illness. Sometimes people think that once they've been diagnosed with a mental illness, they're going to have it forever. And some people do have it at a chronic level, and other people, it's only that episode. Some people also think that they'll never be able to recover, they'll never be able to get out of it. And depression's a bit like that. When you're in the middle of depression, when you're feeling in that big black hole, part of depression's actually feeling like you're never going to get out of it and nobody can help you. But that's not the reality.
What do you think's the worst mental sickness?
Oh, that's a really hard question.
They're all really bad.
Sorry?
They're all real bad.
I would say it's very circumstantial and very dependent on
Yeah,
the
because you might have
individual.
little depression and then big anxiety, but people might have different, say, you could have bipolar or schizophrenia, and you could see just little things from schizophrenia. And actually do not know what bipolar is, so do you know something about it, Alexia?
So bipolar is when you can be one mood, so you can be really happy, and a second you click and you switch to a different feeling. So you can be having a party, be so happy, the next day you're just so sad and annoyed, and it can be passed on genetically, and it's just a really annoying thing that people can get. And I've got a question for you. What is schizophrenia as well?
So schizophrenia is usually when you start thinking about things in a different way. So you're not seeing reality the way it is. You might start thinking that people are all out to get you. You might start thinking that there are ghosts all around the place. You might start seeing ghosts. You might start hearing ghosts. Or you might start hearing things that people aren't saying. So you start going into this state where suddenly reality's been completely, quite transformed. It's a bit like living a night. Often it's a bit like living a nightmare and not being able to wake up.
Can drugs and alcohol provoke schizophrenia?
No. So the rates of schizophrenia have been about 0.9%. So, less than one person in 100 will have schizophrenia, and that's remained pretty constant over the last century and a bit. So it's very much a genetic condition. However, when you start taking drugs, and when you take a lot of drugs or very, very bad, different kind of drugs that are not meant to interact with each other, sometimes you can start seeing things or hearing things that aren't there, or feeling things on your body that actually aren't there. So you start having what's called a psychosis, which is quite often what people with schizophrenia get, is a psychosis. But this psychosis is related because of your drug use as opposed to a mental illness.
Would you say schizophrenia is entirely visual, or can it just be sensory stuff for some people?
It can be sensory, auditory and visual. Having said that, there are lots of cultures that see ghosts, and that doesn't mean that everybody's got schizophrenia. That's part of their cultural story. There are also moments in your life where if you've had quite profound grief, where you might see somebody that you loved that died, or you might hear their voice. That doesn't mean anything's wrong. That's a normal experience around grief. So we've got to be very careful that we don't see normal experiences and start calling that a mental illness.
Do you think?
Got to be very, very careful about that.
Do you think the people from World War I and World War II saw ghosts that they weren't meant to be seen, but it wasn't schizophrenia?
There are a lot of things that came out of World War One, and a lot of very shattered people that came out of the war. So all the trauma that was caused through war, and we know the effects of trauma on people. That for some people they're more likely to have a mental illness, and for some people it just makes their life so much more difficult. So World War One was a very traumatic period, and just after World War One, and that there probably was a rise in mental illness around depression and anxiety, etc., because of the horribleness out of World War One.
So, what is trauma?
So trauma is when you've been overwhelmed. So trauma, physical trauma usually is when you've had, say, somebody grab a big bat and hit you with it and your body just can't cope. So you get bruising, you get things start to hurt, you may get a broken bone, the skin starts to split. Trauma, in terms of mental health trauma, is when you have something big that happens to you and you can't actually cope with it. You psychologically are unable to cope with it over a long period of time. So often our body will shut down with a significant amount of trauma. For a very short period, that's a protective thing, but when it goes over a long period of time, then that trauma starts to affect how you see things and how you worry about, how you might see the world and how you might interact with the world.
Is trauma the same for everyone?
Trauma can be very, very different depending on who you've got around you, whether people believe in you, whether you are believed, whether it's socially acceptable to have that kind of trauma. You only have to have a look at sexual abuse, say 20, 30 years ago when it wasn't acceptable and nobody spoke about it, and how much trauma that caused, as opposed to now it's a much more, people can talk about it and people understand it a little bit more.
Do you think from when the LGBTQ plus community, when they didn't get accepted and it was a law that they could not get married, do you think they got a lot of trauma?
I think that there's the potential of trauma around that, and there's a potential for that to activate other trauma in terms of other injustices that have happened to the LGBTIQ community and not being accepted. So I think there are layers of it, and sometimes it gets it going, the trauma again. Sometimes it reactivates the trauma, and sometimes with something else that might be even more trauma. Often it's a particular event that's happened in somebody's life that causes that trauma.
And Alexia, what is the LGBTQ plus community?
Well, LGBTQ is when it's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and more. And sometimes there's groups that come together and there's gay people, trans people, and they talk about their experiences, and so there's groups like that can help you if you have any problems. So LGBTQ is like just lesbian, intersex, queer, and all that. So
Questioning.
Questioning if you want to say if you're a boy, questioning if you want to be a girl, questioning if you like girls if you're a girl, and questioning if you like boys if you're a boy.
Or if you're sitting in the middle, you're kind of sitting there going,
yeah,
actually, I'm
and
just
that's
really not
that's
quite
what
sure.
bi is.
Yeah.
neutral.
Do you know what bi is?
Bi is basically liking anyone of any sex. So females, males, non-binary, etc. It's all dependent on the person.
I thought that was pansexual.
Pan is more personality.
That's
I
right,
think the person instead of how they identify.
I think it's interesting though because it's not the experience of it being LGBTIQ that's the problem. It's not being in that, having a different sexuality or being attracted to different people.
It's what people think of you.
It's what people do around you that's the big issue. And that's likely to cause some trauma in terms of how people act, how people might bully you for it, how people don't recognise you for who you might be.
But most likely in this generation, seeing that most countries have accepted that and let the law be that two males or two females or that whole LGBTQ plus community can get married, do you think they still get trauma though?
I still think there's a lot of homophobia,
Yeah.
intersexism out there, to be honest with you. And different generations have different experiences because they've lived through lots of things.
And different countries.
And different countries, absolutely.
So, what is homophobia?
Well, it's fundamentally about kind of thinking that people who are homosexual are
It's not
somehow
right.
different and not right, and how we treat them differently because they're not the same as us. And often it's that, what I call the othering, which is kind of that thinking that they're completely different, and we've got to fear them because of that.
Could it be, just wondering, if you are in the LGBTQ plus community, but you're also homophobia?
There is no doubt that there probably is some intersexism or homophobia in the LGBTI community, and bisexism, and I think there probably is some of that.
Do you think that's what leads to depression, because they don't accept themselves either?
I think sometimes, yep, that's true. I think it's very, very difficult to accept yourself when other people don't accept you.
So the LGBTIQ plus community, it's very accepting, but there is a lot of discrimination against some people. So say if someone's in that community, if they're gay, they can be transphobic. And I know I've had a lot of my gay friends be biphobic to me, which is really ironic.
So are you bi?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So going back onto the topic of trauma, what are the symptoms of trauma, would you say?
Trauma, so if you have post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is a trauma response, what's happening is your whole world narrows. You start not enjoying the things that you normally enjoy. You start not doing the things that you would normally do, and you start worrying about things. And there are particular moments, it might be late at night, or it might be when you hear a noise or something, suddenly you have this fear response that runs through you, and you start really worrying, your heart starts pounding, and you start thinking that the same thing that happened last time is going to happen again.
What is the best type of help for someone who has got trauma?
Well, I think some counselling is really, really helpful, and sometimes some drug therapies are also helpful. I think actually going to your GP and talking to your GP about it is a great start. Seeing a counsellor, contacting a health service, very, very important.
But don't you think sometimes with people that are dealing pain get trauma by the pills?
No, not necessarily. I think the danger is when we label people. If we say to somebody that you've got post-traumatic stress disorder and that's all you have and there's not a lot else out there, that's when we've got to be careful that we don't re-traumatise people. But I think sometimes these medications are really, really important for people to help them out. It doesn't help everybody, but for some people it's pretty impressive. It works really, really well.
And going back on the topic of in psych wards, do you think people with trauma should also go on psych wards?
I think that's a really, really complex question. So if they're unsafe to themselves or other people because the trauma's pushed them into something else, then maybe they need to be contained and kept safe for themselves and or for other people. On the other hand, I think sometimes psych wards can be very traumatic for people, so you add trauma on top of trauma, and we want to be very, very careful about that. Nobody really wants to be locked up.
No.
I don't know anybody that really wants to be locked up.
And from a person who's seen a psych ward, not because I've been in one, but it does not look like the happiest place if you are going through a mental stage.
No, it's not. And that's why we try and keep people out of psych wards, because we try and do everything we possibly can.
Unless they're hurting other people.
Unless they're hurting all themselves.
What is a psych ward?
So a psych ward is a building, just like a hospital, and sometimes it can be a hospital and on the second or third level, or a level that has people with traumatic stress or mental illness. And there is quite a few people that go into psych wards, which is not good, but it actually sometimes does help people who have got those problems, but it can also lead to more stress. what do you think, Tim, about what is a psych ward?
So a psych ward is really like you have a hospital that treats you for a broken bone, or if you're really unwell and sick and you need blood transfusion. It's like a mental health hospital where you can go to and receive the medication and the kind of care that you need to, and sometimes the protection that you might need. But they aren't very nice places. I've never liked going into them, when I've worked in them.
Would you say people who have mental health problems are more likely to deal with their problems using drugs and alcohol?
There is some evidence, there is some correlation between higher drug and alcohol usage and mental health. That doesn't mean that all mental health people will use drug and alcohol, or all drug and alcohol people who abuse drug and alcohol are mentally unwell. But there is something about what we call self-medication, and it's usually not very effective self-medication. So people, when they start feeling these symptoms around depression or anxiety or schizophrenia, go, right, well, I'll go and have some drinks of alcohol and that'll make me be better. And what happens is that over the medium to long term, it doesn't help anybody around these kind of things, and it actually makes things a lot worse. So it's actually something we have to be very, very careful about in terms of drug and alcohol and mental health.
Who can diagnose mental illness?
So GPs, so your friendly neighbourhood doctors, psychologists and psychiatrists.
Can they get the illnesses sometimes wrong?
Yes, they can. So sometimes the presentation of illnesses, so how they manifest and how you ask them about it, it's very hard to tell exactly what's happening. So sometimes it takes quite a bit of work to figure out what that mental illness is and what's actually happening for the person. So sometimes they can get it wrong because things look a bit similar. There is no blood test so that you can tell whether somebody's got a mental illness.
What's your view on medication versus counselling?
So that's a really good question. I would say that I wouldn't rule out either. I know some people who've done very, very well with counselling and haven't done well with medication. I know other people who've done exceptionally well with medication and well with counselling. They usually talk about doing it together. So normally if you're on medication, it's good to have some counselling as well. If you're doing some counselling and your mental illness is such that it's really out of control, then some medication's good. People with bipolar disorder, sometimes what they talk about is actually it's really important to have that medication on an ongoing basis.
Can you stop bipolar or schizophrenia?
Most people would say you can't stop it. But you can reduce the symptoms and manage the symptoms. I have a number of friends who live with schizophrenia and live with bipolar, and what they have to do is actually manage their symptoms. So they look after themselves a lot better. They eat well, they exercise, they're aware of their of what's happening mentally to themselves, and they get help when they need to get help. And so they learn how to manage it really, really well.
Does it usually start as a newborn, or does it come when you're an adult?
It starts to, not only, but often it starts to emerge when you're adolescent is the most common time, but it can happen right up into your early and late 20s and sometimes later. So sometimes you find elderly people have higher rates of depression and anxiety.
Okay, to finish up this show, Tim, thank you for being here, and we would just like to ask you a question.
What's your favourite movie?
What's my favourite? That's a very, very good question. Probably Monty Python movies. Now, some of you might be a bit young. You might not have gone through the classics in terms of Monty Python.
Can you say, a name of one?
The Life of Brian.
Oh, yeah, I know that one.
You know that one? Oh, it's just hysterical. I love it. And the other thing I saw recently was Infinity War, which was a bit like...
Don't spoil it.
I'm not going to spoil it, which should have been called Finity War, because I don't want it to go on forever, but it was really good. I got to see it with my kids.
And also, based on that topic, what's your favourite genre of movies?
I really like action movies, actually.
Oh, I like horrors.
You like horrors, eh? No, I get too scared. I just get too scared.
I love horrors.
When my friends come over, I'm like, please can we watch a horror movie? They're like, no, and I cry.
I can't.
I love the Conjuring series, the first one specifically.
Yeah. What about you, Shay? What's your...
Oh, God. My favourite movie is probably The Breakfast Club. I've got to be that nerd. Mine's Breakfast Club. Heather's, that was a good classic.
Heather's is brilliant.
Mine's probably The Breakfast Club, The Awakening, which is sort of around mental illness. I forgot the name. What is it?
I can't.
Oh, you don't know.
Schizophrenia or?
Oh no, it's they get like in a wheelchair. Yeah, a paralysis, something like that.
Yeah.
And also The Green Mile.
What about you?
What about you, Alexa?
Well, I like horror movies, and my favourite would probably be, I know this sounds a little bit sad, but Wolf Creek.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for listening to us, and thank you, Tim, for being here. And we'll like to wrap this up. We'll leave it there. Hope you tune in for next time. It's goodbye from Shay. Oh, from Summer.
Shay.
Alexia.
And Tim, thank you.
Woo, bye.
Bye.